Missionary kid, so I grew up in West Africa, grew up in missions, and caught my passion for the unreached from my father, who was a missionary pioneer in West Africa. And so I grew up with missions in my heart. But my husband and I felt called to work among the unreached when we were studying in college. Both of us were headed for secular degrees, and then felt like God spoke to us really about the needs of the unreached. So when we were in our discipleship training school with YWAM in 1990 in Colorado, that's when we really felt the Lord speaking to us about the nation of Nepal. At that time, Nepal was, the church was still underground. Democracy was just coming to Nepal, and very, very unreached, almost untouched kind of nation. And so we went to Nepal knowing that we wanted to work among the unreached, that we wanted to start a church. But at that time, our understanding of what God was doing was just that we would go and we would plant a church among the unreached. And that was kind of where we were at. But about a year into our time there in Nepal, just as we were getting a good handle on the language and beginning to build relationships in a village area outside of the capital city, George Patterson came to Nepal. George is one of the pioneer leaders in multiplication and church multiplication. And
yeah,
George,
he's a hero of mine, Cindy.
Yeah,
I've interviewed him a couple of times. Great man.
Great guy. Yeah, so George came together with my current leader, the leader of YWAM Frontier Missions right now. His name's Kevin Sutter. And George and Kevin came to Nepal and did a seminar for the handful of us that were attempting church planting efforts there. And that was the first time I really heard about the idea that, oh, we shouldn't be thinking about just planting one church, but we want to think about churches that will multiply, and that we could plant churches that planted churches that planted churches. And that's really when the vision and the dream began. But as with probably many of us, there's been this evolving and process of what's happened in the world of what we now call disciple making movements or church planting movements, which we didn't even have those terms back then. That's happened as we've all learned and grown in this process. But that was really where it began with listening here. We started using some of his materials and experimenting with those as we started our first church plant there in Nepal.
And how did that go?
Yeah, well, it was like the mountains of Nepal. It was an up and down around the the bend kind of journey of learning and growing and trusting God. And I always tell people that when a movement happens, it's because God intervened. It's not because we did things right. Because we certainly made lots and lots of mistakes and didn't do everything by the book. We did what we knew how to do to the best of our ability, but there were a lot of things that we didn't really understand about how movements grow, especially at that time. And yet God worked, and we started in this valley area. It was about an area about 3 hours outside of the capital city. We rented a little room there and would stay there on the weekends, and began to work with a national team as well, national partners that joined us. And we just started sharing about Jesus, sharing our story, and tea stalls, and with people that were nearby. And slowly we came in contact. It took us about 3 months, Steve, at that time, to meet anyone who had ever heard of Jesus. That's how unreached it was at that time. And when you look at Nepal today, that's amazing, because there are so many believers in Nepal now. But at that time, it was a very, very unreached area. And but we finally found one man who had come to the Lord while he was working as a laborer in Bhutan, a very young believer, but wanted to know more. And so we began to do a Bible study with him. And then with a group of young men who were probably about 15 or 16 years old, that gathered in his home, his living room, kind of up above his little tea stall. And we started studying with them, practicing the things that we now call Discovery Bible Study. Back then, we didn't really know that's what that was called, but participatory, study of the Word with them, and they started growing in their faith and wanted to follow Jesus and wanted to know him more, began to reach out to others. But then it came time for us to go on our first leave to return to the States for our fundraising. And again, this was back before the days of Facebook or WhatsApp or any of those ways of communicating. And so we just said to them, this is yours, and this is your valley and your people, and if it's up to you to reach them, and we're going to be gone for a while, but this great commission that Jesus has given us for you. And so we prayed for them, we blessed them to go and make disciples of their own people, and then we returned back to the States for our leave, and prayed and hoped that they would stick, that we had, shared enough, discipled enough that they wouldn't fall away. And we were gone for several months. I think it was about 6 months, and returned to Nepal, not knowing if any of them would still be following Jesus, we just had no idea, had no contact. And we returned back and, got in touch with them, and they shared with us that, what you told us to do, we've done. And there are 30 people who are ready to be baptized. So can you come and baptize them? And we said, that is amazing. You guys are awesome. But no, we can't baptize them. You guys have to baptize them. They're your disciples, but we'll teach you how to do that. And that was really how that first little church was born in that valley area. And they did. Those young men, baptized their fathers and mothers and people they brought to the Lord. And about 30 people were baptized that first day by them. And then we just continued training them how to multiply that and see those groups grow, and see that little church that has started begin to start others. And it was just amazing, to see how these young men grew as apostolic leaders. And within just a few years, that work had multiplied to over 1,000, and then up to 2,000, and 30, 40 churches that were started and were spreading, and they were going to other districts of Nepal. And it was amazing to see what God did. But Stu, it really was a God thing. I think one of the things that we learned early on was to not be in front, to really let it be theirs. And I remember George talking about back then and training us in, being a midwife rather than the parent, and I think that was such a key thing that helped us to get the right DNA, was to really let it be theirs. It wasn't our church, it was their church, it was their valley, it was their nation, and we were there to come alongside, to be in the background, and to mentor and disciple, but and to support, and yet not to lead from the front. And I think that was one of the things that was key for us. I think we also learned that God works in spite of us. Our language wasn't amazing. We were, we made lots of mistakes and did things, in ways that I wouldn't do them today. And yet God loves people, and he wants to reach them. And if we'll just put ourselves out there and obey, he will work if we don't give up. I think that was another thing we learned, is don't give up. And as that work began, it didn't depend on us. It really depended on them. And our role was to come alongside. Just that God did, I think he brought the right people to us. And some of the people that we thought were going to be the people he would work through weren't. And we had to learn to not invest too much, not put all our eggs in one basket. I think when we were first starting in that valley area, we met some people that we thought were really good influencers. They were heads of households. They were people that listened to our story and welcomed us. But they weren't ready to make a commitment to follow Jesus. And we had to be willing to go through some of those relationships where people maybe wanted to know us because we were foreigners, or there was something they wanted to gain, and to sort of sort through that and not be discouraged by that, but to keep looking for those people who are really hungry. And I think another thing we learned is that God can use young people. At that point, we were, I think, especially looking for older, influencers, a village head or someone like that who would come to the Lord and would bring a lot of others with them. And that certainly happens in many places. But in our story, it was young men who were, in the Nepal context, because they were elder sons in their families, though they were young, they had influence in their families, and their families looked to them for new things that should be embraced, and so their families did follow them into the faith. But we kind of stumbled upon that, rather than knowing that ahead of time. As it began to grow, I think we had to continue to train them to stay simple. The temptation was very strong to, to bring in, even though in Nepal the church was still just brand new out of, it's amazing how rapidly church structures can kind of become prominent. And so that was something that we really emphasized with the leadership, that everyone needs to stay involved in disciple making, and it's not not to separate. And even those who did a discipleship training school with that short 3 or 6 month training were suddenly the ones who were more qualified than the average person. And so we had to kind of fight against that as we did leadership training, and really encouraged them to appoint leaders who were elders in the sense of the biblical qualifications, but not look to education, not look to those who've done more training, Christian training. And that was something that was important, I think, as we saw things multiply. And they did. They had some amazing, still have some amazing leaders who were just men and women of God. They moved in power, and they saw the Holy Spirit work, miracles happen, demons cast out. And to identify those people who had that sort of apostolic anointing and were moving with God as men and women of God, rather than looking towards training. And but it was something we had to be really intentional about, because the pull was there.
As it grows, were there also outside influences saying, look, we can give you a salary, or we'd like your church to join our movement, all those sorts of things?
Absolutely. Yeah. Those are always there, it seems. And we had some people that left and joined other organizations, things like that. But one of the things that Victor Chowdhury said that I've always remembered, I don't know if you know Victor from India, another amazing movement leader and father in movements. But he said, if you make sons and daughters, no one can steal them. But if you have workers, they're easy to buy, you just offer them a higher salary. And I think that was something that we really took to heart, was that these were, we were family and invested deeply in relationships with the leaders. And we didn't lose those people. They, it's not that they were loyal to us, but the relationships were strong, and they had bought into the vision, and they had a good understanding of the New Testament principles. And so they didn't want to run off and do something in a way that they'd get a bigger salary, but they wouldn't be able to see multiplication like what they were seeing.
Well, what happened next in your journey?
So that work continued to grow, and we stayed engaged in training and mentoring, coaching the leaders. But we then started training other church planners and Nepali church planning teams to go to Nepal, be involved in starting work in new areas. And then that started to take off, and we were able to see about 30 church planning teams raised up to go across Nepal, all made up nationals. And then we lost our visa, and we suddenly, and it's still a bit of a mystery what actually happened with our visa situation, other than to say that in hindsight, we know God led us. You know, it wasn't a word of the Lord, but it was a closed door that led us to cross the border into India. And at that time, I was serving as the leader of YWAM Frontier Missions for that part of India and Nepal. And so we crossed the border with our 3 kids, and kind of suddenly, and hated India at first. It was huge culture shock. We had so bought into Nepal and loved Nepal, and we spoke the language well. Our 3 kids had been born there. It was, it was where we thought we'd spend the rest of our lives. But we crossed over into India, and then God began to open our eyes to see the people of India with his eyes. And so we began doing what we do, making disciples wherever we went, and training people to be disciple makers. And I guess that's one of the life lessons, I would say, even today as we're here sitting in Minnesota. I'm not able to go back to the country I normally live in and the place I want to be. But somebody asked me the other day, what, how do you cope with this? And I said, it goes back to, I know who I am, and what I'm called to do is to be a disciple maker. And we can do that anywhere. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can do that anywhere in the world. We can do that anytime. And, our calling, our core calling is not to live in a particular location, but our core calling is to be a disciple maker, be someone who obeys Jesus' command to make disciples, who make disciples and see his kingdom come. And so we moved over to India, and we started making disciples there, learning a new language. We started learning Bengali, and started working in slum communities in our city there across the border. And again, doing something similar in a whole different context of launching a disciple-making movement there. Again, we had a lot of failures, a lot of ups and downs, but learned a lot of lessons, and we're able to see groups start that began to multiply there. We really felt like the Lord was speaking to us about the slum communities and the poor and needy as well in our city, the urban poor. And so that was a bit of a new context, because people groups were very mixed in the slums. And so we started by doing an assessment, meeting community leaders and finding out what were the strengths and assets that they had, and also the areas where they felt they needed help. And one of the things that they brought up were the needs of widows and the needs of malnourished babies was another thing we found. And so we started going door to door, doing nutrition counseling with families who had small children and weighing the babies. And that was kind of the way that we built relationships in the community. And through that, and this is a fun story I like to tell, through that we met a family that they were Bihari, actually. We met this family, and they had a baby who was 7 months old and only weighed 7 pounds, very severely malnourished child. That's a birth weight for many healthy babies. And so she was very, very sick. Her name was Kusi, a little baby girl. Kusi means happy. and she was just skin and bones. And so we started going and talking to the family about how they, we gave some baby formula and did different things to try to help them. And right about that time, one of my closest colleagues was killed in an accident. She was hit, an army truck hit an auto rickshaw that she was riding in, and she died. And so it was a great tragedy that happened. And of course, I was devastated, and all kinds of things related to that loss. But I came back from her funeral and remembered this little baby. And I thought, this baby's going to die if I don't go and check on this child. And so I went to the home of, this little home in the slums to check on this baby in the midst of that grief and pain. And the baby had lost more weight. And so I called my husband and said, I think we need to bring this child home. And he agreed to that. And so we brought little Kusi into our home and asked her father if we could help him with his baby. And we didn't want to adopt her or anything. We just wanted to help. And so we brought little Kusi home. And when we did that, he and his entire extended family were so surprised that we didn't want anything from them. We just wanted to love their child. And they really couldn't get their head around it, but he would come to visit her, and he came, and I remember him sitting on our living room couch and saying to me, he said, Cindy, Dee Dee said, when you came and you shared with us about Jesus, I thought, why do I need Jesus? I already have so many gods. Why would I need another God? But when I see the way that you love my little girl, when you have no reason to, I know that your Jesus is real, And so it was that act of mercy, I guess, that, and extending ourselves to this little girl that opened the door to his heart. And then he brought his whole family, and we were able to show the Jesus film to them and share with them, and the whole extended family received Christ. And that was how the first little group was started in that slum in their home. And through this baby, who then after a few months was fully recovered, and we returned her back to her father and to that family. But that's how things got started there. And he then became an elder in the house church there, and that church started multiplying and growing as well. There's a lot of ups and downs, and we had people come to the Lord that then betrayed us, or would brought persecution on the other believers. We had lots and lots of ups and downs, and people that showed interest and did well and then would fall away, or lots of learning, ups and downs. But eventually this kind of core group formed we used storytelling with them. So we did a storying approach, and we would tell a Bible story, have them repeat the story, and then use the discovery questions with that. And those stories started to really take root and change worldview for them. And then they started to multiply those groups. And, that particular work didn't grow into a full-blown movement of, many generations, but we did see multiplying growth. But at that time, I was asked to lead YWAM's Frontier Missions work for South Asia. And we were training, we were wanting to see movements. We were learning from David Garrison and, all the great guys like yourself, teaching us and training. And we really wanted to see movements. And we had seen a few, 2 or 3 as YWAM Frontier Missions, but we really hadn't seen the kind of breakthroughs that we were wanting to see. But I guess what we were looking for was rapid organic growth, that where without us manipulating it or having a lot of control of it, spontaneous multiplication was happening, where disciples were going somewhere, starting a group. That group was starting other groups, and it was beginning to spread, into 4, 5, 6, more generations, without external assistance or help or even input, or even their knowledge, that it would just start to mushroom and multiply.
So you had this new role for, I don't know, what is that, a couple of billion people, South Asia.
Couple billion people, absolutely overwhelmed and terrified to be in that kind of a role. Was very much out of my realm. And I went away on a retreat. And I said, God, what in the world, I don't know why I'm in this role, but I know you chose me. And what is it that you want to do? Speak to me. And as I was on this retreat up in Sikkim, I felt like the Lord spoke to me from Luke chapter 19, the parable of the minas. And I tell this story at the beginning of my devotional book, Faith to Move Mountains, that I wrote together with Kevin. But this parable of the minas was such a significant story for me. And God just spoke to me through that, how this nobleman, he receives his, he's going to go away and receive his kingdom, and he calls the servants, and the 10 servants come, and he gives them each, a mina, and he says, put this to work until I return, and then he goes away, he comes back, he calls them again, and the three of them, we don't know what happened to 7 of them, but 3 of them, not everybody likes to report, right? So 3 of them come and they report, and the one says, Master, I took the one that you'd given and I've made it 10. And the master says, well done, my good and faithful servant. And he gives him authority over 10 cities. And then the second servant, comes with the 5. And he says, I took the one, I've made it 5. And he also is given authority over 5 cities. And then the third servant says, Master, I was afraid. And so here's the one, I return it back to you. And God just spoke to me so strongly through that parable that he expects us to multiply what he's given us. He places people and resources and things in our hands, and he wants them to be multiplied. When he returns, he wants to hear that we've put it to work and we've multiplied his kingdom. And yet we can't do that apart from him. But I had such a strong sense that God wanted me to believe him for a 10-fold multiplication, that we would see 10-fold increase of the number of believers in the churches that YWAM had started there in South Asia. And that was a huge step of faith to even start to speak that out and believe for that. But at that time, we had about 9,000 believers in the churches that have been started by YWAM in our region. And I began to ask God for 100,000. Lord, we want to see a 10-fold increase of growth. And one of the things that, I've learned since that was actually happening was God was giving me that big, bold vision that was way beyond what I could do myself. And it sort of thrust us as a mission, and myself and the other leaders I was working with, into change that we will never see that if we don't change the way we're working. And though we've been talking about church planting movements, we've been talking about multiplication, we're going to have to change the way that we operate. And
what did those changes end up looking like?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we started with, and I'm so grateful to my leader, Kevin, who led us in this, but we went through a process of really examining our beliefs and our practices. And what did we believe about is ripe? God's word says that. Jesus said, the harvest is ripe, the laborers are few. Look to the fields, they're ripe to harvest. Do we really believe that? And do our actions show that we believe that? Or are we just saying we believe that? So we began this process of really examining our beliefs related to our behavior. And that process was really significant in releasing new growth and really seeing movements begin to take off through the teams that we were leading and training. Because yeah, up until then, I think for many of us working among the unreached, we would say things like, to see a Tibetan Buddhist come to Christ, they have to hear the gospel 7 times, or to, people, there was just a mentality that it's going to take a long time and the harvest isn't ripe, really, is what our behavior showed and what our words said, though we read scripture. So we worked hard on some of those beliefs. Some of the other things we changed was how we trained people, really looking at training as a process with people as opposed to an event. Up until then, we had a lot of training events, and YWAM is great for training events. But really seeing training as a process of working with people towards multiplication and towards seeing disciple making take off. And we instituted a lot more coaching at that time. And but I would say it was the belief change, and we worked hard on that with talking about our beliefs and working on that with our church planning teams, and it began to shift our results in pretty significant ways as those beliefs started to shift.
Mm. So what did you see? What was the fruit of that shift in beliefs?
Yeah, so we started seeing multiplication. We started seeing, up until then, a lot of our teams had only seen, daughter churches or maybe granddaughter churches. I think that was kind of the extent of the multiplication that was happening. But another belief we worked on is that everyone can be a disciple maker. You don't need special training. So that was a belief shift that we worked on, and we started seeing that happen. That the churches started to see 3rd and 4th and 5th generation growth. Another example, we talked about God can use anyone, even women, to be disciple makers, and we trained some of our church planners in how to share your testimony in 3 minutes and how to train your people how to do that. And so they went back, and there was just one example of a Nepali brother in North India. He went back and he taught the disciples that he was working with, he taught them all the 3-minute testimony. And there was a lady in his fellowship who had never led anyone to the Lord. She came every week, she was faithful, she loved Jesus, but she had never been equipped and trained to share with others. And so she went and attended this training, practiced her 3-minute testimony, and within a month she led 30 people into faith. And so again, those kinds of principles that everyone can do this, simple training, it started to sink in that they didn't have to do a DTS. I mean, as much as YWAM we love the discipleship training school, not everyone has to do a discipleship training school to become a disciple maker. And we had to really shift that thinking. That was important for us in our particular background and organization to see that multiplication take off. Some of our movements in South India started to just explode as trainers. They got trained in simple ways. They went and trained their disciples. Those disciples trained others, and we saw many, many new groups starting to form. And 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th, 8th generation just started to kind of mushroom. So it's really beautiful to see what God did. So we're probably about at 70,000 now. So we're not quite at tenfold increase, but we've come a long way from the 9,000 or so. So from 9,000 to 70,000 or so, I'd say.
How did you change in that whole journey?
The pruning processes of God can be painful, and yet he prunes us and he, like I said, there are a lot of highs and a lot of lows as we went through that whole process of pursuing a dream from God. And there were sacrifices, and there were some real challenges, relationship challenges that came, persecution from inside and from outside. And I think, how did I change? I think I'm even more aware of what a privilege it is to work with God, because it's not us. If anything good happens, it's him, and I think realizing that he can use anyone, even someone like me. He really can use any of us that are willing to be used by him. So I think faith grew in my heart, but also a deep dependency on him, that really it has to be God. And I think I became more of a woman of prayer, on my face a lot when we face those challenges, and believing that only God could do this, and yet he can. So those are some of the changes, I think. Yeah. Well, God always has more. He's a God of exponential growth, and his vision is always bigger. So, yeah, after 8 years serving in that role, I had the privilege of passing the baton to an Indian leader that was kind of my Timothy, and someone I had trained and loved so much, and that was a real joy. And then I took a sabbatical and asked God what was next. And during that sabbatical, he spoke to me about starting a blog and starting to write about disciple-making movements and the lessons that we'd been learning, and looking at how we could encourage people, especially Global South workers, through that blog. And so I started that, and that's been just really exciting to see a lot of people equipped through that blog, regularly going out, and starting to meet people from all over the world, and be able to have an influence and be able to train and mentor them. So, for example, I met a young man from Kenya through Twitter, which was so weird. But anyway, he got in touch with me through my blog and things on Twitter, and I started coaching him, and he's seen, hundreds of churches started, and, multiplication began to happen. So, yeah, what am I dreaming about? I'm just really excited. Again, another thing the Lord spoke to me was to start an online course on getting started in disciple-making movements. We launched that last year, and we've had 500 students go through that course. And that has just been so fun to see how God has used something like that to equip and inspire and help people begin to start movements around the world. So I'm dreaming of, first we were dreaming of 10-fold increase. I'm dreaming of 30, 60, 100-fold increase, and really seeing in the next 3 to 5 years that we'll see, tens and thousands and hundreds, just that 10-fold increase move to 100-fold increase. So it's kind of mind-boggling, but that's what I believe God is really wanting to do, and I want to be a part of it.